Welcome back to Still Night History. I'm Manuel, and I'm so glad you're here again. Tucked under your blankets, ready to let the modern world fade away for a while. Last time we explored the dark corners of the plague years, but tonight I want to take you to the year 1385. We are moving forward in time to focus on something much more relatable, yet equally disastrous: dinner. You see, we live in an era of air fryers, instant noodles, and spices that cost $3 at the supermarket. But in the late 14th century, eating was a high-stakes game of survival, creativity, and, quite often, eating things that weren't technically food. If you think your office lunch is sad, wait until you hear about the medieval version of a drive-through. Before we dive into the pot of mystery stew, I have a question for you tonight. If you were transported back to 1385 and could only take one modern seasoning or condiment with you to survive the medieval diet, what would it be? Salt? Hot sauce? Or maybe just a bottle of ketchup to hide the taste of the turnip? Let me know in the comments while you're still awake. I'd love to know what your survival flavor would be. Now, close your eyes, ignore that slight hunger in your stomach, and let's explore the original fast food, the great spice scams, and why a beaver was once considered a fish. Imagine you are walking through a medieval village in 1385 as the sun begins to set. There is a smell in the air that you wouldn't recognize today. It's a mix of wood smoke, damp earth, and something heavy, like boiling cabbage that's been on the stove since Tuesday. This is the scent of the pottage. The pottage was the eternal heartbeat of the medieval kitchen. It was a pot that never really went cold. You'd throw in some onions, a handful of oats, and if you were lucky, a stray piece of bacon that had been hanging from the rafters for 6 months. But the foundation of every meal, the thing that kept you alive and gave you the strength to go out and work the fields the next morning, was bread. Now, bread in 1385 wasn't just a side dish. It was your social identity. It was your ID card and your bank statement all rolled into one. If you were a noble, you ate something called manchet. This was the gold standard. It was made of wheat that had been sifted through fine cloth so many times that all the bran and the grit were gone. It was white, soft, and probably tasted like a cloud. It was the iPhone Pro Max of carbohydrates. But you and I? We aren't nobles. We are the people of the dirt. And for us, there was the black bread. This wasn't that fancy artisanal sourdough you buy for $8 today. This was Mars-Lin, a brutal mixture of rye, barley, and whatever the miller decided to sweep off the floor that morning. In a bad harvest year, the miller might stretch the flour by adding a bit of sawdust or finely ground pea shells. The bread was so dense it could be used as a structural material for a small shed. It was dark. It was heavy, and it was filled with tiny bits of stone from the millstones. Medieval people actually had very worn-down teeth, not because of sugar, as they had almost no sugar, but because they were essentially eating sandpaper every time they took a bite of a sandwich. And the most interesting part? They didn't even use plates. Why wash a dish when you can eat it? They used trenchers, which were thick, stale slices of 4-day-old black bread. You'd pour your soup or your greasy pottage directly onto the bread. By the time you finished the liquid, the bread had soaked up all the juices, fats, and mystery flavors. That soggy, heavy mass was your favorite part of the meal. Or, if you were feeling particularly holy, you'd give the soaked trencher to the poor at the gate. It was the first biodegradable packaging in human history, though I imagine it felt more like eating a wet sponge. But let's talk about flavor. Or the lack of it. If you were a peasant, your life was a long, grey parade of turnips. The turnip is the most humble of vegetables. It doesn't scream for attention. It just sits there, being round and slightly bitter. There were 100 ways to ruin a turnip, and the medieval cook knew them all. You could boil it until it was a sad mush, you could roast it until it was a charred rock, or you could hide it in a pie and pretend it was meat. But if you wanted real flavour, you needed spices. And this is where the late 1300s gets truly wild. Spices like black pepper, cinnamon, and ginger weren't just ingredients, they were symbols of extreme wealth. A pound of saffron cost more than a horse. If you had a spice rack in 1385, you were basically the Elon Musk of the village. Because spices were so expensive, the medieval world invented the food scam. This was the dark side of the culinary world. Street vendors in the big cities like London or Paris were the original hustlers. They knew that a rich merchant wanted to impress his friends with a spicy feast, so they sold premium pepper that was actually 50% dried rat droppings or crushed charcoal. They sold ginger that was mixed with dried sawdust. Saffron was the biggest scam of all. They would take old horse blankets, shred the wool into tiny threads, and dye them with onion skins to make them look like saffron filaments. People were literally eating pieces of a horse's bed just to feel like they were part of the elite. Imagine the dinner party. You take a bite of your expensive spice swan, and you think, my, this has a very earthy, woolly aftertaste. It must be from the Orient. No, Gary, you're just eating a rug. This obsession with flavour also led to the creation of the first fast food stalls. In the crowded streets of 1385, most poor city dwellers didn't even have a kitchen. Their houses were tiny wooden boxes with no fireplace because, well, fire and wooden boxes don't mix well. So they had to buy their food from cookshops. These were the ancestors of McDonald's, but without the toy in the Happy Meal. You could buy a meat pie for a penny. But there was a catch, there were no health inspectors. The meat in that pie could have been a cow that died of old age, a very large rat, or, according to some urban legends of the time, the cat that used to hang around the shop until Tuesday. To hide the taste of rotting meat, the cooks would bury it in a mountain of cheap, fake spices and salt. It was the ultimate gamble. You ate the pie, and you prayed to every saint you knew that you'd still be upright by sunset. Speaking of saints, we have to talk about the church and the Great Beaver loophole. This is one of my favourite parts of history because it shows how creative humans get when they are hungry. The medieval church was very strict. You had to fast for about 150 days a year. No meat on Fridays, no meat on Saturdays, no meat during Lent. For a society that did back-breaking labour in the fields, eating nothing but fish and cabbage for a third of the year was a nightmare. So, they started looking for loopholes. They looked at the beaver, a furry, buck-toothed mammal that builds dams. They saw its scaly tail and the fact that it spent most of its time in the water. The theologians sat down, had a very long meeting, and declared, the tail of a beaver is scaly. Therefore, the tail is a fish. And since the tail is attached to the beaver, the whole beaver is technically a fish. And just like that, beaver stew became the favourite Friday night dinner for monks across Europe. They did the same with the barnacle goose. People actually believed that these geese grew on trees over the ocean and fell into the water when they were ripe. Since they grew on trees like fruit and lived in the water like fish, they weren't considered meat. You could eat a roasted goose during Lent and still be a good Christian. It's a beautiful kind of mental gymnastics. I can almost see a monk staring at a juicy roasted beaver tail, whispering, "Thank you, Lord, for this delicious trout." It's the kind of survival instinct that makes me proud of our ancestors. They weren't just survivors, they were lawyers of the dinner table. And then there was the drink. You've probably heard that nobody drank water in the Middle Ages because it was dirty. That's a bit of a myth. They knew what clean spring water was, but in the cities, the water was indeed a liquid death trap. So, they drank ale. Everyone. Even the children. They drank something called small beer, which was a low-alcohol brew made from the leftover grain. It was hydrating, it provided calories, and it kept everyone in a state of very mild, sleepy happiness. It's why the late 14th century feels so slow and dreamy. Everyone was about 1% buzzed at all times. It helped with the turnip diet. Everything tastes a bit better when you've had 2 pints of fermented barley for breakfast. Think about the contrast as you lay there in your comfortable bed. You have a refrigerator that stays at a constant 4 degrees. You have salt that is perfectly white and flows like silk. If you want a spice from India, you click a button and it arrives at your door. The medieval peasant lived in a world of extremes, extreme hunger, extreme flavors, and extreme scams. Their food was a battle. A battle against the millstones, a battle against the fake spice merchants, and a battle against the church's calendar. But there was a certain honesty to it. When they sat down at the end of a long day in 1385, under the dim light of a tallow candle that smelled like a wet cow, that bowl of pottage was the greatest victory in the world. They didn't have much, but they had the comfort of the fire and the shared trenchers of bread. They didn't worry about calories or gluten or keto diets. They just worried about whether the beaver they were eating was fished enough to keep them out of purgatory. And as the fire in the hearth turned to embers and the small beer began to take effect, they would curl up on their straw mattresses, dreaming of a world where bread was white and spices didn't taste like sawdust. You are living in their dream right now. You are in the future they couldn't even imagine. A world of infinite food and perfect spices. So, as you drift off to sleep, take a moment to be grateful that you don't have to bite into a piece of black bread filled with gravel tomorrow morning. Be glad that your ginger is actually ginger and not a shredded horse blanket. Your stomach is full, your bed is warm, and the only turnip in your life is the one you choose to buy. The Middle Ages was a loud, crunchy, and strangely flavored time. But tonight, it's just a story. A story to help you relax, to help you feel the weight of your blankets, and to remind you that even in the darkest, most boring parts of history, there was a human heart trying to find a way to make a turnip taste like a miracle. Close your eyes now. The pottage is simmering, the small beer is poured, and the village is finally quiet. You don't have to worry about the price of pepper tonight. You just have to rest. You've earned it. The world of 1385 is far away, lost in the mists of time, leaving only the sound of my voice and the peace of your room. And let us continue with the second history of the evening. Let's examine what hygiene and baths were like during the medieval period. The Middle Ages often suffer from a bit of a PR crisis. When we think of the medieval period, we usually imagine mud-caked peasants, narrow streets flowing with waste, and people who hadn't seen a bar of soap since the fall of Rome. However, the reality of medieval hygiene is far more nuanced, surprisingly sophisticated, and, dare I say, cleaner than Hollywood would have you believe. While they certainly didn't have high-pressure power showers or scented body washes from a mall, the people of the Middle Ages cared deeply about their physical appearance and their scent, driven by a combination of social status, religious duty, and a medical misunderstanding of how disease actually spread. To understand medieval hygiene, we first have to dismantle the myth that everyone was filthy. In truth, cleanliness was a mark of civility. The Dark Ages were not dark because people stopped washing, they were dark because the centralized infrastructure of the Roman Empire, including those massive, sprawling public bathhouses, began to crumble. Yet, the desire for water remained. For the medieval mind, being clean was often synonymous with being a good Christian. The phrase cleanliness is next to godliness wasn't popularized until much later, but the sentiment was very much alive in the 12th and 13th centuries. The culture of the bath. In the early and high Middle Ages, bathing was actually a communal, social event. While the Grand Roman thermae were gone, they were replaced by smaller, local stews for public bathhouses. In cities like London, Paris, and Florence, these bathhouses were popular meeting spots. You didn't just go there to get the dirt off your skin, you went there to gossip, negotiate business deals, and eat. The process of a medieval bath was quite the production. Since there was no running water, every gallon had to be carried by hand from a well or river and then heated over a fire. Because of this labor-intensive process, people often shared bath water. In a wealthy household, the lord would bathe first in fresh, hot water scented with herbs like rose petals, lavender, or mint. Then his family would follow, and finally the servants. This is likely where the old, though slightly exaggerated, saying "don't throw the baby out with the bath water" originates. By the time the infant got in, the water was so murky you might lose track of them. For those who couldn't afford a massive wooden tub, dry washing was common. People would use a basin of water and a linen cloth to scrub the most important parts, the face, the hands, and the private areas. They understood that sweat caused odors, and while they didn't understand bacteria, they believed in the miasma theory. This theory suggested that diseases like the plague were carried through bad air or foul smells. Therefore, smelling good wasn't just about vanity, it was a literal shield against death. If you could smell flowers instead of rot, you were, in their minds, safe from infection. Dental care and hair maintenance. We often imagine medieval mouths full of blackened, rotting teeth. Surprisingly, many skeletons from the era show remarkably healthy dental structures. This is largely because the average person had zero access to refined sugar. Without the constant assault of sucrose, cavities were much less common than they are today. Medieval people were quite proactive about dental health. They used chew sticks, twigs from trees like hazel or birch, to fray the ends and brush away food particles. They also made tooth powders out of burnt breadcrumbs, charcoal, or ground marble mixed with herbs like sage. For fresh breath, they chewed on fennel seeds, cloves, or parsley. If a tooth did become infected, there were no fillings. The local barber surgeon would simply pull it out with a pair of pliers, usually without any anesthesia other than a stiff drink of ale. Hair was another focal point of hygiene. Long, flowing hair was a sign of status and health for both men and women. To keep it clean, they used alkaline lye soaps or herbal rinses. Because washing long hair in a tub was a massive chore that could take an entire day to dry, many women relied on dry shampooing by brushing their hair vigorously with boar bristle brushes to distribute oils and then applying powders like flour or ground orris root to soak up the grease. The great stink, urban sanitation. The real challenge to medieval hygiene wasn't the people, it was the cities. As populations grew, the infrastructure couldn't keep up. In cities like Paris or London, houses were packed tightly together, and the streets were often unpaved. Domestic animals like pigs and chickens roamed freely, contributing to the mess. The most notorious aspect of medieval life was the garderobe, the medieval toilet. In a castle, this was often a small stone closet with a hole that dropped waste directly into a moat or a cesspit below. In the city, people used chamber pots. While there were strict laws in many cities against throwing the contents of your chamber pot out of the window, contrary to the popular Gardeloo myth, people frequently dumped waste into the central gutter of the street, hoping the next rainstorm would wash it away. However, we shouldn't assume the authorities did nothing. By the 14th century, many cities had rakers, men hired to clean the streets and haul waste away to rural areas to be used as fertilizer. There were also gong firmers, individuals whose sole, and very well-paid, job was to empty the city's cesspits in the middle of the night. It was a dangerous, disgusting job, but it was essential for preventing the city from being swallowed by its own refuse. The Black Death and the Great Change. The turning point for medieval hygiene was the arrival of the Black Death in 1347. This catastrophic plague killed nearly a third of Europe's population. Because doctors at the time believed the disease entered the body through open pores, they began to warn against hot baths. They thought that hot water opened the skin and allowed the poisoned air of the plague to seep into the bloodstream. As a result, public bathhouses began to close across Europe. The social culture of bathing shifted. Instead of submerging the body in water, the wealthy transitioned to a linen-based hygiene system. They believed that if they wore clean, white linen against their skin, the fabric would absorb the dirt and sweat from their bodies. As long as the linen was changed daily and looked crisp and white, the person was considered clean. This shifted the focus of hygiene from the skin to the wardrobe, a trend that would persist well into the 18th century. Soap and industry. Soap was not a mystery to the medieval world. It was produced in various forms, ranging from harsh, caustic soaps made from wood ash and animal fat, tallow used for laundry, to fine, luxurious soaps imported from the Mediterranean. Castile soap, made with olive oil, was a prized luxury item from Spain. Laundry was a back-breaking task usually reserved for laundresses. Clothes were soaked in lye water, which was sometimes treated with aged urine because the ammonia helped strip stains, beaten with wooden paddles, and then laid out on bleaching greens to let the sun whiten the fabric. This process was so intense that it was only done a few times a year for heavy items, though undergarments were washed much more frequently. The role of the church. The church's relationship with hygiene was complex. On one hand, monks and nuns were often the cleanest people in society. Monasteries were built with advanced hydraulic systems, featuring lavatoria where monks would wash their hands before meals and specialized plumbing for their latrines. Cleanliness was part of the monastic rule. On the other hand, there was a subset of extremely religious individuals, ascetics, who practiced holy filth. They believed that neglecting the body was a way to focus entirely on the soul. Saint Francis of Assisi and others famously avoided bathing as a form of penance. However, this was seen as an extreme, saintly sacrifice precisely because it was so unpleasant. For the average person, being dirty was not a sign of holiness, it was a sign of poverty or laziness. Conclusion: a different kind of clean. If you were to step into a 13th century marketplace, would it smell different than a modern city? Absolutely. It would smell of wood smoke, animal manure, tanned leather, and unwashed wool. But you wouldn't necessarily see people covered in layers of grime. You would see people with combed hair, trimmed nails, and faces washed with herbal waters. The medieval person's struggle wasn't a lack of desire for cleanliness, it was a lack of convenience. They fought a constant battle against the elements with nothing but buckets, hand-carved soap, and a profound belief that smelling like a rose might just keep the reaper at bay. They weren't dirty by choice, they were simply clean in a way that required a lot more hard work than turning a handle in a tiled shower. By understanding their hygiene, we see the medieval people not as primitive caricatures, but as resilient individuals doing their best to maintain dignity and health in a world without tap water. Their methods were different, their science was flawed, but their effort was immense. So, the next time you see a movie with a mud-smeared knight, remember, he probably had a bottle of lavender oil and a linen cloth tucked away in his little bag, waiting for the next stream.